The story of the Forbidden City is not just a story about a building or a palace, it is the story of how the greatest economic power on earth built an empire behind red walls that no ordinary person could enter, filled it with more wealth than all of Europe combined, and then lost everything because it refused to change. In 1420, the emperor of the Ming Dynasty decided to move his capital from Nanjing to Beijing, and he ordered the construction of a palace so massive and so expensive that it required over 1 million workers to build it, and this palace became known as the Forbidden City. But this was not just a place where the emperor lived and ruled, it was actually the financial command center of the entire Chinese empire, the place where all the important decisions about money, trade, taxes, and silver were made. And from this one location, the emperor controlled the economy of nearly 150 million people across the entire empire. The Ming Dynasty had created something extraordinary, a centralized financial machine that gave them incredible power and incredible wealth. And for a while, this system worked perfectly because China was not just a powerful nation, it was the global manufacturing superpower of the world, producing silk, porcelain, tea, and countless other products that people in Europe and other parts of the world desperately wanted and were willing to pay enormous amounts of money to get. The problem was that Europe did not have products that China wanted, so instead of trading goods for goods, Europe had to pay for Chinese products with one thing and one thing only: silver. And by the 16th century, massive amounts of silver from the Spanish Americas began flowing into China through global trade networks, and some historians estimate that during this period 1/3 of all the silver in the entire world ended up in Ming China, which made the Forbidden City not just the center of political power, but the center of the world's largest silver economy, a financial fortress that seemed untouchable and permanent and eternal. However, as time went on, the cracks in the system began to show, and they showed in ways that nobody in the Forbidden City seemed to understand or care about. The fundamental problem with the Ming Dynasty as economy was that it had become completely and totally dependent on silver, not just as a form of money, but as the only form of money that mattered. And this meant that farmers had to pay their taxes in silver, officials had to be paid in silver, the military had to be funded with silver, and even the government's ability to function depended entirely on having a steady supply of silver coming in from international trade, which meant that if silver supply was disrupted for any reason, the entire system would collapse like a house of cards. To understand how dangerous this was, imagine if a modern country decided to run its entire economy on only one foreign currency and nothing else, so that every single transaction, every single payment, every single piece of government funding had to happen in that one currency. And if the supply of that currency suddenly dropped, you would instantly have massive economic problems. And that is exactly what happened to China in the early 1600s. The silver shipments from the Americas began to slow down dramatically because of piracy on the ocean, because of wars in Europe, because of the decline of Spanish power, and suddenly, after centuries of silver flowing into China in massive quantities, the supply began to shrink. And when silver became scarce, prices skyrocketed because everybody needed silver to do anything, and farmers who had to pay their taxes in silver suddenly could not afford to pay those taxes because they did not have enough silver, and local economies began to freeze up and stop working properly. What happened to China in the 1600s was actually a form of deflation, which is when prices fall and money becomes harder to get. But it happened centuries before modern economists even had a word for this economic problem, and it created enormous suffering across the countryside as farmers starved, as harvests failed, as poverty spread across the empire. But the most shocking thing was that inside the Forbidden City, the emperor and his court officials were sitting around debating philosophy and having fancy banquets while the country was falling apart outside the walls. And they seemed to have no idea or no concern about what was happening to the regular people. Then, to make matters even worse, droughts came to China, and when droughts came, the crops failed, and when crops failed, there was famine. And when there was famine, people began to rebel against the government, and by this time the treasury of the Forbidden City, which had once been so full of silver that it seemed like the richest place on earth, was nearly empty. And this raises the most important question of this entire story: how could the richest empire on earth run out of money? The answer is shocking and simple at the same time, and it reveals the fatal decision that destroyed everything. Instead of looking at their economic problems and trying to reform the system and fix what was broken, the court officials inside the Forbidden City made a decision that would prove to be catastrophic, and that decision was to raise taxes, and they did this right in the middle of an economic collapse. When people had less money than ever before, the government squeezed farmers harder and demanded more silver. which created a vicious cycle where bad harvests led to less silver coming in, which led to the government raising taxes even more to try to make up for the lost money, which led to less silver again because people could not afford to pay higher taxes, which led to more anger and more suffering among the people. This cycle of taxation and suffering continued to get worse and worse, and as it did, rebel armies began to form across the country, and one particularly powerful rebel leader named Li Zicheng began marching toward Beijing with his army. And as he got closer and closer to the capital, panic spread through the Forbidden City because the officials and the emperor finally realized that their financial fortress was about to fall, but it was too late to do anything about it. And the emperor of the collapsing Ming Dynasty faced a brutal reality that he could not escape, which was that the empire was not broke because it lacked silver in some distant way. It was broke because it had built its entire economy on a single form of money and had become completely dependent on it, and when that dependence caught up with them, there was nothing they could do. In 1640, for the city of Beijing fell to the rebel forces, and the emperor, faced with the humiliation of defeat and the knowledge that everything he had inherited was destroyed on his watch, climbed a hill behind the palace and hanged himself, and the gates of the Forbidden City opened for the first time in centuries. And what had seemed like an untouchable financial fortress, a place where the emperor controlled the wealth of the world, had proven to be fragile and vulnerable. And the gates opened and the people poured in and discovered that the treasury was nearly empty, that the great wealth had been squandered, that the system had collapsed. But the story of the Forbidden City does not end with the fall of the Ming Dynasty, because the next dynasty, called the Qing Dynasty, took control of China after the Ming fell, and at first, the Qing Dynasty seemed to learn from the mistakes of their predecessors, and they worked to restore stability to the country. They rebalanced the tax system to be less harsh on farmers. They expanded the territory that China controlled, and for a time China seemed to regain some of its financial strength. But unfortunately, the Qing Dynasty was not able to completely break free from the patterns that had destroyed the Ming, and isolation began to return to China's economy. Trade restrictions tightened, and the empire began to underestimate the power of global capitalism and the changes that were happening in the world. While Europe was industrializing and building factories and developing new technologies and creating the modern world, China remained an agrarian society that relied on agriculture. And the silver dependence that had destroyed the Ming Dynasty continued to haunt the Qing Dynasty as well. And then came external pressure from outside the empire, and this external pressure came in the form of the Opium Wars, which were a series of conflicts between China and Western powers where Western nations forced China to open its borders to trade on Western terms. And these wars resulted in massive amounts of silver flowing out of China instead of flowing in, which was the exact opposite of what had happened during the time of the Ming Dynasty when silver was flowing in from all over the world. And by the 19th century, China's situation had completely reversed, and instead of being the place where the world's silver came to rest, China was now losing silver constantly, and the Forbidden City, which had once been the vault of the entire world and the center of global wealth, became nothing more than a symbol of a nation that refused to change and refused to adapt to the new realities of the modern world. The story of the collapse of the Forbidden City and the end of imperial rule is not just a story about politics and power. It is a story about financial miscalculation and the dangers of over-centralization and the extreme risks that come from relying on a single form of money or a single trade route or a single source of wealth. And it shows that even the greatest empires can fall if they refuse to adapt and refuse to change as the world changes around them. In 1912, after nearly 500 years of centralized economic control, imperial rule finally ended in China, and the Forbidden City, which had once been the center of absolute power and absolute control, became a relic of the past. But the real fallout from the collapse of the Ming Dynasty and the struggles of the Qing Dynasty was not just political. It was a massive financial catastrophe that showed the dangers of economic rigidity and the importance of being flexible and adaptable when the world changes. The Forbidden City teaches a powerful financial lesson that is still relevant today, and that lesson is that wealth concentration and the appearance of unlimited power and stability can actually hide deep structural weaknesses. And when an economic system becomes too rigid and too dependent on one thing, it becomes extremely fragile and vulnerable to collapse, because if that one thing changes or disappears or becomes less available, then the entire system falls apart with it. The Ming Dynasty's economy relied too heavily on silver imports from the Americas, and when global liquidity changed and silver became scarcer, The empire had no way to adjust or adapt to these new conditions, and the system collapsed because it had no flexibility and no alternatives. In today's world, many nations still follow patterns that are similar to what destroyed the Ming Dynasty, and these nations rely heavily on reserve currencies. They depend on complex supply chains, they trust in centralized banking systems, and they believe that their economic dominance is permanent and will last forever. But history shows us that this kind of thinking is dangerous, and that economic empires do not collapse overnight in some dramatic moment of crisis. Instead, they slowly ignore warning signs, they delay making necessary reforms, they believe that their dominance will last forever, and they refuse to adapt until it is far too late, and by the time they finally realize that something needs to change, the damage is already done. If we look at the example of the Forbidden City and the Ming Dynasty, we can see that a 500-year empire which seemed powerful beyond measure and which controlled more wealth than any other nation on earth was unable to survive monetary mismanagement and rigid economic thinking, and this raises the important question of what makes modern economies different, or whether they are actually different at all. The Forbidden City still stands in Beijing today, and millions of tourists walk through its halls every year and marvel at its architecture and its history. But most people who visit the Forbidden City do not understand the real story of that building, because the real story is not about emperors and their palaces and their luxurious lives. The real story is about capital and how capital flows through an economy and how capital can be concentrated in dangerous ways. The real story is about control and how absolute control of money can seem powerful but can actually be extremely fragile, and the real story is about the cost of financial inflexibility and what happens when an economic system refuses to change. The wealth that once flowed into the Forbidden City in the form of silver from all over the world did not disappear overnight. Instead, it drained away slowly over decades, and as it drained away, the system that depended on it became weaker and weaker, until finally it could not support itself anymore and the empire collapsed. The lesson of the Forbidden City is that economic power, no matter how great it seems or how long it has existed, can always be lost if the system becomes too rigid and too dependent on conditions that might change. And the Forbidden City shows us that building a fortress to protect your wealth is not enough if the fortress itself becomes a trap that prevents you from adapting to new conditions in the world. When the Spanish stopped sending silver to China, the Ming Dynasty did not adapt by finding new sources of wealth or by reforming their economic system. Instead, they tried to hold on to the old system by raising taxes and squeezing people harder, and this made things worse instead of better, and eventually the whole system collapsed. And this same pattern has happened over and over again throughout history, and it is happening today in various parts of the world where nations and corporations and individuals are trying to hold on to old ways of doing things instead of adapting to new realities. The Forbidden City was built by an empire that was confident that it would rule forever, and it was built to protect wealth and power. But instead it became a symbol of that empire's inability to change and adapt, and when the gates finally opened and the people poured in, they found not the infinite treasures they had imagined, but an empty vault that showed the world that the greatest empire on earth had destroyed itself through its own inflexibility and its own refusal to change.